Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of how does the Kremlin man the war in Ukraine? Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, podcasts, and other publications. Today's guest is Dr. Olesya Tkacheva. She's an assistant professor at the Brussels School of Governance and currently a George F. Kennan Fellow at the Kennan Institute. Her current research focuses on civil-military relations and the military mobilization in Russia. She has over a decade of experience working in the transatlantic policy space in the areas of cyber and information warfare, democratic resilience, and Russian military strategy. And she previously held positions at the RAND Corporation and in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense. After our guest speaks, there will be a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit your question via the Q&A function on Zoom. And please remember to include your name and affiliation when doing so. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. Dr. Tkacheva, please, the floor is yours.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for having me. And I'm also thankful to the Kennan Institute for sponsoring my research and organizing this public presentation. Let me begin by sharing my screen. That's always useful way to start. And I hope, yeah, okay, so that's much better. So the event that I'm focusing on happened a year ago. On September 21st, President Putin announced that he's going to mobilize about 0.1% of the Russia's 3 million reserve force, and with the goal to increase Russia's footprint in Ukraine. So that was the result of the drastic casualties that Russia's troops experienced in the theater, and he needed to strengthen the footprint in the theater. So one of the peculiar features of this decree is that it lacked any specific details about who is going to be mobilized, what are the criteria, how the people will be selected. He said, all I need is like 300,000 young men in the age of like between 80 to 35 to be sent to the to war. And he asked the governors, the heads of the regions, to work out the details. Okay, so I trust that you can implement my decree and you select and compile the list of people who will be deployed. Okay, and then there was behind the scene negotiations between each governor and the region, and each region received a quota. Okay, so this is the target number that the governors were expected to supply, and those numbers are not publicly known. Okay, so this is a very intransparent way of determining how each region will be contributing to the war in Ukraine. What we know, however, let me just continue with there have been, however, vast variation in the per capita distribution of young men who were selected to be sent to Ukraine. Okay, I will talk a little bit later about where this data come from, but if we look at the big picture, so the darker areas are the ones that have higher per capita share of reservists who were supposed to go to Ukraine, who were selected and designated to be sent to Ukraine. And then there are regions that have received relatively light quotas, right? The number of reservists as a share of the young males residing in the region. So I'm accounting for the fact that each region has different concentration of the young males, partially because due to the concentration of high universities, colleges, vis-a-vis like other areas. But what we see huge cross-country variation in the per capita allocation of the number of men who were supposed to go to fight in Ukraine. Now, what is happening here? I'm looking at the puzzle, at the very interesting correlation between the support for the regime as it was manifested in 2021 Duma election and the share of mobilized population. So one interesting trend that emerges, if you look at this data, is that regions in which we observed relatively low share of votes received by the United Russia on the party lists in 2021 Duma election, they tend to have higher target numbers or higher share of the individuals or young men who were supposed to be mobilized, were mobilized and sent to Ukraine, vis-a-vis those regions that show high level of support for the regime, such as Chechnya, for example, voting close to like 99% share of voters casting their ballots for United Russia, and then their quotas are relatively low. Okay, so there seems to be an inverse correlation between the support towards regime, as it's indicated in the official election results, with full understanding that, okay, those election results are padded, we cannot trust those results that much, but there's still there seems to be a negative correlation between the region vote for the United Russia and then the subsequent share of young men who were mobilized and sent to Ukraine. So why? How can we explain this inverse correlation? What's going on? Why does regime punish the opposition, right? So this is what looks like. So the hypothesis that could be relevant and that I'm trying to test in this study is that the way to understand this inverse correlation, we have to look at the overall structure of how Russia mans its war in Ukraine. And there are several channels through which troops are deployed in the theater, and some channels are voluntarily channels because there is a system that allows people to enlist as contractors. And what I am trying to see, I'm trying to understand that whether there is a correlation between regions in which the support for the regime is high for ideological reasons, because unfortunately there is still substantial share of Russian population who believes that what is done in Ukraine is consistent with Russia's national interest, and this is good for the country. So in those regions, we would expect to see high share of people who enlist as contractors, and therefore, when mobilization started, they already contributed enough soldiers to the war in Ukraine. Vis-a-vis, there are other regions which are economically successful regions such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, that do not have very strong ideological support for the regime. And in those regions, the share of contractors was relatively low, and therefore, what the regime had to do, it had to introduce mobilization to force people to participate in the war in Ukraine. So this is kind of operating hypothesis that I'm trying to unpack, and the challenge that I'm running into because I don't have data to test it directly. Okay, so this is a little bit of background. So what are the sources or the channels by which Russia mans the current operations in the theater? So these are the officers, right? So this is the backbone of the command and control structure. They are trained at the military academies, military colleges. So these are the professional officers, right? Then there are contractors who come from domestic and foreign citizens. And one of the reasons why people decide to join the armed forces in Russia as contractors before the war was the Russian armed forces provided the stable employment for individuals residing in low income areas, in areas with the depressed employment. So they provided the form of gainful sources of income for young men who did not have alternative opportunities, alternative employment opportunities. Then we also know that there is private military companies, as we saw in case of Prigozhin. They contributed in major way to advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the theater. So they are backbone of the Russian effort in Ukraine. And then there are reservists. So there are two types of reservists. One are so-called passive reservists, people who finish their mandatory year-long service in the Russian forces. They become part of reserve. Those are people who graduate from the universities and they're exempt from the military service and they become part of reserve because they received some background training, military training. And then there is a combat ready reserve. I'm just trying to minimize one second. Yes, that's better. And then there is a combat ready reserve, which comes from the contractors who sign the contract with the state, and they participate in regular routine training exercises in assembly. So this is combat ready reserve is pattern after the model like in the United States, when people actively participate in military assemblies to preserve their combat readiness. And then there are conscripts. So officially, Russian Ministry of Defense is not supposed to be sending the young men who are doing the year-long service in the armed forces to the front line. However, there are plenty of anecdotal evidence that this is not actually what's happening, with the mothers of the soldiers going very vocal and providing the instances when the young men who were mobilized were actually deployed, who were not supposed to be. So it's more like de facto. So my project, ideally, I would like to have data on all of this, but at the end of the day, the data that I currently have focuses on the reservists, okay? And particularly on the passive reserve, because these are the ones who were targeted by the mobilization decree that Putin issued a year ago. Okay, so this is what I'm looking for, and this is what I have data. So what are my data sources? So this is where lots of effort was spent to understand what's happening, and the Russian government tries to conceal and tries to hide as much information as possible about military operation. They do not allow disclosing, for example, death rates, mortality rates, casualty rates in the theater. They clearly do not want the population know who is being selected for the mobilization effort. However, these records, the lists of people who were targeted and who were supposed to go who were selected, identified by the Ministry of Defense, were circulated on Russian social media channels, partially as an early warning to those individuals who were designated by the state that they will be drafted and sent to the theater. So there was like communities of the online communities and different Russian social media sources where those links were leaked. Okay, and this is what I'm using. I'm using the leaked information. And then I'm also supplementing those records with the data which are available through the official statistical publications such as the Russia's regions, Region России, official election results that I showed you already, as well as the information that was collected by the Russian independent newspapers that looked at the casualties rates and also the information that focused on the protests. So it's a combination. So it's a data digging exercise. Okay, that's why I look at it as a big data analysis. So the first thing to realize is that the outcome of this mobilization depends on multiple factors, because multiple actors are involved in this mobilization effort. So the first, I will go backwards, institutional capacity. The first thing to realize is that the regional enlistment offices or even municipal enlistment offices, as well as the municipal governments, play an important part in the mobilization process because they are the holders of the critical information about ages of individuals, their background, whether they have any military training, what kind of military training they receive, and where to locate them. Because at the time of mobilization, Russia relied on the Soviet system of issuing draft notes, where individuals had to be physically located by the military officials, and then those draft notes had to be signed, given, handed in, and then a person had to acknowledge by signing that they received this mobilization notice, right? And then they have to report to the enlistment officers. So for you to be able to locate, for the Kremlin to be able to locate the prospective individuals, the local bureaucrats and the regional officials have to maintain very detailed records and up-to-date records. It was not always the case because keeping records is time-consuming, and you have to have sufficient resources, institutional capacity to do so. So, and there is also opportunities for corruption and exploiting the loopholes, and because it's partial mobilization, so how those 300,000 individuals are selected is far from being clear. Then there is an economic factors, because at the end of the day, we have to remember that Russia has to mobilize and expand its military production, right, to meet the war needs. And then those individuals who are working for the factories, who are contributing to the production of the ammunition and the equipment necessary for the effort in the theater, they should not be drafted because they contributed in another way. And then there is also need, so agricultural sector, because mobilization was announced at the time when there was harvest, right? So there was lots of pushback from the economic actors who didn't want to lose their capacity to produce industrial output, right? And then there is a political context on which I'm focusing here is, first of all, public support for the war, right? The people who are pro-war and who are supporting the regime on ideological grounds, they're much more willing to show up at the enlistment offices, and they're also much more willing to enlist as contractors. So this is the component of the support for the regime. Then there is also loyalty at the level of governors and also at the level of mayors, whether in fact they are supporting Putin and where they want to use this mobilization effort as an opportunity to signal loyalty to the regime, because then at the end they expect to be rewarded in terms of their terms being extended, reappointed, and any other types of perks that they will extract from the Kremlin later, okay? And also level of public support for the regime. So when you combine this all together, you will see cross-regional variation in the mobilization rates. Now, so interestingly, so now I'm going to look at the economic factors. So what's going on in terms of the correlation between economic drivers behind the mobilization rates and the mobilization. So this is the graph that looks at the correlation between unemployment rates for young males, the age category between 18 and 35, those ones who were identified as targeted by mobilization decree, and the mobilization rates and unemployment among them. So what we do see that mobilization tends to be concentrated at the higher rates in those regions that have greater unemployment rates among young males. Makes sense, because from the economic point of view, you're much less likely to have the pushback from the economic actors if there is lots of idle young men whom they could either replace, whom they could substitute, or either designate those unemployed young men as a potential people to be drafted and sent to Ukraine. So there is seems to be positive correlation between the unemployment and the mobilization rate. Okay, now the second interesting factor is as the death rate continue to increase, so this is the killed in Ukraine. The data was collected before a mobilization was announced. So those rates as what is the concentration of people who were killed in Ukraine before the mobilization started, and this is the rates per region. So some regions contributed very little, like Moscow and St. Petersburg. They did not have high share of contractors going and fighting in Ukraine for obvious reasons. There were some other areas, for example, Leningradskaya Oblast, because this is affluent areas and they have they offer lots of economic opportunities for young men. So the incentive to sign up as a contractor is relatively low compared to the Far East regions such as Buryatia and then like other Far East regions with high concentration of the low-income individuals. So they are the ones who were sending contractors, mostly contractors in Ukraine. So what happens after mobilization is announced, there is a negative correlation. So what we see is there is an attempt to spread out the costs of war to those regions who were not contributing already in terms of the contractors. And this is indirect support to the hypothesis with which I started about. So if those regions already contributing a lot, then they're not going to be expecting to contribute in the form of the mobilized men, in the form of reservists, because they already experienced high participation in the form of contractors, and vice versa. Okay. Now, what I've been doing so far, I've been looking at each factor individually. Now, what I'm putting together is like multivariate regression for people who are not familiar with multivariate regression so do not worry. What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to look at the relative importance of each factor, right? So not individually, but let's look at three factors together: unemployment, support for the United Russia, and then the death rates. And what I don't want to see, I don't want to see these intervals touching the red line, okay? Because if it touches the red line, so the effect is zero in statistical terms. But if it does not touch the red line, then the effect is either negative or positive, because this is zero. So this is no effect. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing, once we put these three factors together, the prior efforts, contribution to the war, the unemployment, and then the support for the United Russia, the variable that stands to be relevant in statistical terms is support for the United Russia. The lower the support for the United Russia, the more young men are mobilized to be sent to Ukraine. Now, so what I will do here, because how did Russian society respond to mobilization? Okay, this becomes also very important. So what we saw many young people were leaving the country at the moment invasion started in February, but at the same time in the fall when mobilization was announced, okay? It received high publicity among the Western sources, media sources. So this part, I mean, received lots of publicity. I'm not going to talk about it. Another way how the Russians reacted was the anti-war demonstrations. They were pro-peace demonstrations in February, and then later anti-mobilization demonstration in September when the regime announced mobilization. And then another strategy was trying to exploit the partial nature of mobilization. And it was wait and see, and maybe I can hire a lawyer, and then the lawyer finds a loophole based on my marital status, for example, or based on my employment. If I'm employed in IT industry, for example, then IT industry got exempt, or maybe my employer can lobby for me. So this is more like wait and see strategy and exploitation of the loopholes. Now, what's interesting, this is the comparison of the trends, time trends. So this is from the Google search, tickets in Russian, and then отсрочка or deferral, let's do this wait and see strategy. And what we see, we have a spike in the search trends with the larger volume going to the tickets. Let's try to find the ticket and let's get out of the country. And then still significant share of searches are concentrated on trying to defer, finding the loophole, legal loophole to evade the draft. And if you look at the distribution, regional distribution, the Far East regions, or the regions that already had high death rates before mobilization, they look for tickets. And then the regions with high concentration of the Russian, like ethnic Russian, and also the regions who are not contributing a lot in terms of the contractors that have relatively low mortality rates, they look for deferral. So there is a cross-regional variation. I'm not showing it for the time purpose, but I'm more than happy to discuss it later. And then this is the anti-war process and anti-war demonstration. So what we see, in February, late February or early March, we see a wave of pro-peace demonstrations in different cities in Russia. And then what regime tries to do, it tries to catch up by creating rally behind the flag and with the top-down mobilized pro-war, let's support pro-victory, let's support our troops in Ukraine, like concerts and other types of activities. And then we see also the form of the resistance in terms of the attack. First, there were attacks on the transportation networks. Let's make it harder for the Russian authorities to deliver logistic supplies, supply the troops in Ukraine. And then after mobilization was announced, people started burning enlistment offices, right? So if you just destroy the records of individuals as they located, where they located, how old they are, what kind of military training they received, then local officials will not be able to include you in those lists of mobilized people. So what I'm doing, I'm looking at these red spikes, and I'm looking at cross-regional variation in these red spikes and try to see whether the mobilization punishes those individuals or those regions that had high concentration of pro-war, pro-peace demonstrations in the very beginning, and then anti-mobilization demonstrations during the mobilization. So the same exercise, I'm doing this regression analysis, and here I'm replacing the support towards United Russia with anti-war protests, so frequency of anti-war protests in the region. And then this is what I get. So once again, this is a positive correlation. So those regions that experienced high level of anti-war grassroots mobilization, they are receiving higher quotas. So they are expected to send higher share of their individuals, young men, to the theater. And then once again, economic factors do not matter that much, and the prior death rates do not matter that much. So what? Okay. So one thing to realize is people were puzzled why we have not seen waves or more intensive pushback against the war in Ukraine, okay? And one thing is that wait and see option, or trying to find deferral and trying to evade the draft, reduces the incentives for the open opposition, because if the regime punishes the opposition by sending those individuals whom they, once they arrested during their participation in the pro-peace rallies, and sent directly to the theater, so this significantly reduces incentive to participate in anti-war demonstrations, right? Another thing we also observed, especially during the first 6 months of the after mobilization, is that deploying those Russian citizens who do not support the regime for ideological reasons into the theater reduces the Russia's troops' will to fight. And that is very consistent with anecdotal evidence how the mobilized reservists, they were not willing to take the orders, they were refusing actually to engage in certain types of, to carry out certain types of activities and participate in certain missions in Ukraine, so rightly so, because they are not committed ideologically to the cause of this war. We also saw that the regime learned, because it tried to reduce its dependence on these intermediary actors, on the administrators at the municipal level, on the governors. So now there is the electronic subpoena law, or in which individuals receive their draft notes by emails. And the moment the draft note is sent, then individuals are liable for, required to show up at the enlistment office. They cannot leave the country. So they change the nature of interaction between the potential, between reservists and the regime, making it much more direct and less dependent on the intermediaries. And then the regime started looking for additional carrots to incentivize individuals to sign up as contractors. So it looks like understanding, especially in the in the light of upcoming and the regional and local elections just happened last weekend, and then upcoming presidential elections. So there is a greater emphasis now on the economic incentives. So let's increase the sign-up bonus. Let's increase the benefits that the veterans receive and also the families of those who killed in actions. So the regime tries to incentivize increase voluntarily participation in the war in Ukraine rather than using the sticks. However, one of the interesting features of this mobilization is that there was no suspension of the mobilization law. So as of today, mobilization is ongoing. And from the anecdotal evidence, it is perpetual. So rather than trying to have another round of 300 individuals or another wave of mass mobilization, what the officials are doing is they are selectively pursue, on ongoing basis, they recruit a much smaller share of the young men. So they're mobilizing, but on a smaller scale to make it much less noticeable. I will stop it at that because it's 30 minutes and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I'm sure everyone agrees, that was absolutely fascinating, Olesya. From the data you've collected to the analysis you applied, I took a ton of notes for myself. That was fantastic. I invite now our audience, please to send in questions you might have. And again, to send your questions, please do it via the Q&A function on Zoom. And remember to include your name and affiliation. And I will start reading the questions. Maybe first, I'll ask a question for you. I really liked that slide. First of all, the slides are fantastic as well. The way it was so clear. The one where you talked about factors affecting mobilization rates. I was just curious, in the time that you've now been looking at the data and you're collecting more, are you seeing any shifting in the factors? Like, was one more prominent initially and now you're seeing maybe another one coming to the fore? Have you seen any variance, or also what do you anticipate over time?
Well, okay, so unfortunately, I have only one single snapshot of data because it's really hard to kind of continue collecting this type of data. So my data are cross-sectional, okay? Ideally, I would like to have the time series, but my understanding of the nature and the type of individuals who are being now mobilized vis-a-vis during like last year comes from anecdotal evidence, right? And what we see in the newspaper accounts, in the social media accounts, first of all, is the age of individuals, because what the Russian authorities did, they expanded the age, the bandwidth, right? They extended the bandwidth. So in terms of the young males, now, I mean, they pushed it to 35 rather than it was until 30, and also up to 60, 65. So we see elderly people enlisting as contractors, but among the type of like skills that the most like in high demand based on the positions that are open in the like employment opportunities, they're looking for technicians, so mechanics who can repair the equipment that was destroyed. They're looking for drivers, tractor drivers, bus drivers, then who could be very fast, quickly retrained to become a tank, right? So tank driver, driver of the other type of vehicles. And they need people who are capable of building fortifications, right? So civil engineers, because at the end of the day, they trying to fortify and consolidate the control over the annexed regions. And this is a very long front line, and they need to build fortifications, right? And also rebuild the civilian infrastructure. So this is one of the very interesting and bothering. What bothers me as the Western analyst is that there is the competition for hearts and minds of people who are on occupied territories. And for all practical purposes, the way how the Kremlin treats those illegally annexed regions, in which they actually just had elections for the mayoral and the regional governors, is that to provide infrastructure, such as the hospitals, housing, schools. So they are rebuilding, trying to create the appearance that they are restoring infrastructure. And whom do they send there? So civil constructors, right? So this is what's going on in terms of the type of skills and that they need. Yeah, so that's.
Wow, no, thank you. First question here I'll take from the audience. So from Mark, just to be clear, are quote contractors what we would call enlisted personnel, or is there a difference?
Okay, so no, it's well, it's a little bit not quite the same terminology between enlisted and contractors. So contractors are the people who sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense and they are compensated for their service. Usually those contracts run between 3, 5, and up to 10 years. Okay, so you can renew it up to 10 years. So this is the type of individuals that I'm talking about. But then there are people who are enlisted because they are required to serve a mandatory year, and now there are 2. Before the war, it was a year. So all young males, okay, in Russia are required by law to go through the military service. And then if you admitted to the university that provides military training, then you are exempt, so you defer it. But there is a legal obligation that all young men go through the military service. So those are more like enlisted, if you would like to use the analogy, the Western analogy, but it doesn't quite apply. Okay, so that's, I hope it's clarified.
No, that's great. Next question from Daniel White. In addition to issues of capacity, levy troops, there also seem to be constraints on Russia's capability to maintain a large standing army. For example, the limits of Russia's ability to sustain troops in the field, ability to effectively control combat formations, and risk tolerance for expanding the military as an institution whose interests could begin diverging from the Kremlin as casualties mounts. What is the effective limit to what manpower Russia can actually use in the war without contributing to political destabilization? Do you see this capacity increasing or decreasing as the Kremlin increasingly attempts to centralize control of the war under loyalists in the wake of Prigozhin rebellion? I'm interested because, as you pointed out, the politically unreliable seem to be levied at higher rates during the partial mobilization. This doesn't seem like a good long-term strategy, as it effectively brings people with similar politics and gives them guns.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is a really, really great question, and there are several themes that emerge from it. So the first one is what have the Russians learned from the losses, especially during the first 6 months of the invasion, and what changes have they made in the way how they organized their troops on the ground? So what we saw, there was this shift in their strategic thinking, a high-level doctrinal thinking about what kind of wars that they will be fighting and how the force structure corresponds to the strategic objectives. Because before the war, the way how Russian troops were organized is to engage in a short-term expeditionary warfare, and they were organized in smaller units that were rapidly deployed outside of Russia's territory, right? So this is the battalion groups, if you would like, the ones that they used in Syria, for example, the ones that they deployed in Georgia during 2008. So mobility and deployability outside of Russia's territory was one of the key strategic objectives. Now, After like the first phases of invasion, after Ukrainians managed to push back the Russian troops in Kharkiv and also in Kiev, those battle groups turned out to be highly unstable. And they were not resilient, and they had extremely high. They lost a lot of equipment and high mortality rate. So high casualties rate. And then as a result of that, Ministry of Defense announced that they're switching back to the Soviet-style organization of the Russia's armed forces, which is based on the divisions, okay? And those divisions, they just like massive amounts of people, and they are overcompensating. They are creating this increasing resilience of the units and allowing to feed them or replenish them by expanding the size, the scale. So mobility is being sacrificed in exchange for resilience. And the reason why, because now the wars are taking place closer to the Russian borders. So Russians learned a lot, and they're shifting the overall structure of the military forces. Then they also added two military districts. So the idea, they expanded the size. So now they went from 1 million to 2 million standing force. They increased the share of the enlisted officers or enlisted men compared to the contractors. So there have been major reorganization implemented to make to change in response to type of wars that the Russians are fighting. So this is very disturbing and very worrisome. That, like, as a looking at it from the point of view. Now, what is the appetite for the Russian population, right? So why didn't we see greater enthusiasm at the grassroots level for the Prigozhin rebellion, for example, right? So miscalculated. How come Prigozhin miscalculated and he was not supported by the people, by the population? So it's very. This is one of the biggest puzzle. I mean, it's one of the type of like 1 million question. And unfortunately, I don't have insights because what's happening, Russian society became very isolated and atomized. So we switched from the type of the regime that usually people call authoritarian regime to the totalitarian regime. Right now, there is more and more literature in political science which is emerges that says, well, whether authoritarian regime is the correct way to characterize the political system and the amount of repression and what is going on to the what is being done to the opposition leaders. And so this could be one of the tendencies that then the population the form of civil society relations, big state society relations, they will shift from resistance to resilience. From the opposition to resistance, and resistance is much more private and much more, how should I say it, much harder to detect, right? Rather than the open protest and open pro-peace rallies. So this is another very unfortunate trend. That's why it's very hard to estimate or guesstimate where is the threshold, where is the pain threshold among the Russian population, and we don't know. I wish I knew, but we don't.
No, that was excellent. And actually what you said is a good segue for the next two questions that are coming up. Next question from Michael Keys is, that was really informative. What sense do you have that people in Russia know of the casualties? Is it like what we saw during the Afghanistan war or not? Are there soldiers' mothers' committees protesting like then or not? Thank you.
Okay, this is actually great. What do the Russian people know about the cost of war? So there's been an attempt by multiple independent newspapers, I mean media outlets such as the Media Zone and Medusa and BBC News, and then a couple of scholars based in Europe to collect data based on the self-reported reports from the family members, okay? So the regime discourages any type of publicity related to the casualties, because in the first 6 months of the war, the regional authorities, for example, they were organizing the virtual memory walls, right? For example, let's honor the heroes who lost their lives fighting against, like, the Nazis, right, in Ukraine. And then they would put the names of the officers in particular. They would have funerals, military funerals for the officers who were killed in Ukraine. And then the Kremlin said this information discloses too much about the military operation, and they ban. So this is considered to be state secret, reporting anything related to the casualties rates, right? However, nevertheless, there is data that comes out and shows that numbers are close to, I'm citing from the memory, but it's close to 200,000, 250,000 of Russians killed, based on the, for example, the cemeteries, right? The military cemeteries, they keep expanding the number of graves. The question, however, is the regime is trying to buy the support of the families, providing the benefits, post-mortal benefits to the family members in the form of kids gonna get free education at the top military colleges, okay? Family gets very generous pension. Family of people who was killed gets what is this called? Mortgage vacation, meaning that you're not paying your mortgages for a certain period of time, or you get interest-free mortgage. So the number of benefits increase up to 60. So if each month they come up with something, some kind of additional incentive or some kind of compensation. So what regime is trying to do is really tries to buy off the families of the people who lost their lives, right? Yeah, so that's basically what's happening. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. The next two questions are related, so I'm going to combine them. Vasilu asks, how many people have been mobilized, men and women? And then Robert asks, do you see any limits on how many soldiers Putin can mobilize?
Okay. So how many people have been mobilized officially since the 300,000 target was announced? We do not know, because, as I mentioned, the regime was smart enough. They never set mobilization stop. They never officially came out with an order saying this is the end of the mobilization period, which means that every day somebody is being mobilized, and what the enlistment officers and the military officials started doing, rather than mobilizing them and not paying anything, young men are invited to the enlistment offices for verification of their contact information, because now you have to have your up-to-date email address. And this is where the people are brainstorm and saying, look, if you sign up as a contractor, here is this sign-up bonus, and you get on spot. You can use it to, I don't know, to improve financial situation of your family. You will be paid like really generous salary, like per each day in theater. So what they're doing, they scaled up the effort to increase the number of people who signed up voluntarily. They extended, they completely changed their PR, publicity, public relations, and the marketing around what it's like to be in the armed forces. And the way how they post the jobs, there is a huge disparities between the positions that are advertised that you're going to be deployed and positions that it's 10 times different, like in terms of the pay scale. The positions that you will be part of the armed forces, but you will stay in the relatively safe, right, behind the frontline theater. So, yeah, so they're changing this a lot. Yeah, I will stop it at that. And there was what is the limit? Okay, so that's a very important question. So what is the limit is the constraints that the military-industrial complex faces, right? Because one of the lessons learned during this mass mobilization is that, okay, so you brought those, first of all, logistics, right? The buses. How do you provide transportation? You mobilized 300 individuals, so spread out across the country. You need to bring them first to the training grounds and then from the training grounds to the theater. So logistics lines of the buses and trains, so ground transportation. And then one of the things that came up, there was not enough uniforms, there was not enough ammunition, there was not enough first aid kits, for example. The people who were mobilized were told, now you have to reach back to your families and ask them to send you, here is the list, and you should supply. And we also saw that regional officials been playing a very critical role in that, crucial role, because now each governor or each region has the military units that named after that region. So, for example, they have, so when they try to keep the reservists and mobilized men together, right? So if you want to fight with your neighbors from the same city, and governors supply those military units. So it comes out from the regional budgets. And if you look at the size of the military expenditures in the subnational budget, they've been ballooning, but because there is cross-regional variation in the ability to pay, there is also some units were supplied better than others. So what are the constraints? Is the ability to arm those young men, because Russia has been suffering significant loss in the equipment, tanks, and the other types of vehicles. So that's the major constraint. I would put it this way. Yeah.
Excellent. We've got quite a few questions here. Unfortunately, we're not going to get through all of them. And so I'm trying to. The next question that's in the queue, Michael Keyes, based on your theory, I would imagine we see more recruiting from Khabarovsk and Primoria in the Russian Far East, where United Russia did not fare well in previous elections. Is that the case? And yeah, there's a couple questions I'll try to find related to kind of regional variations.
Yeah, that's actually what I am seeing. The Far East regions, they are, the areas in which the support for United Russia has been relatively weak compared to other parts of the country. Yeah, this is what we're seeing. I agree. So that's the good intuition.
Excellent. Next question from Mark Tkacheva from Korea Economic Institute. What is the proportion of contracted personnel serving in Ukraine as opposed to mobilized reservists?
We don't have data on that. Okay, so no, we don't have data. The closest approximation is based on the mortality rates, but it's harder because it's hard to say whether the officer, so usually there is distinction between whether the person was the officer, whether a person was the private, and then whether that person was a part of the private military company. So we don't have data. At least I don't have. Maybe some researchers, other researchers have. I do not know.
Excellent. Here, a question from Natalia from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you for the presentation. Is there any information about where people from different regions are sent? Is it possible that they send people from Buryatia, for example, more often to the more dangerous zones? I'm thinking here about the slide with the death mobilization distribution. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have this data. That's why this is the limitation of the data set that I'm using, because I know where these people are from, so their residential addresses, because authorities needed it, but I have no idea at which point they were deployed, because the training time frame varied between 3 days. You get 3 days of training versus several months, and then where they were sent. So this part I really do not know.
No, it's tricky. I'm sure everyone's wondering, we would love to see all these different kinds of data, and it's amazing, frankly, the data that you have. Here's another question about Roberto Hernandez. Is there any reliable data with tracking payout of death benefits for fallen Russian soldiers?
That's actually a good question. Not the ones that I know of, because there have been lots of anecdotal evidence that people were not able to receive, to begin with, their sign-up bonuses, and then the families never received the benefits. And then going back to the soldier mothers NGOs, right? So some of them were declared foreign agents, okay? So now they're not really quite legal in Russia, because at some point they received potentially a guidance from the West. But what the Russian regime started doing is talking about changing their marketing strategy. Now they bring the representatives from the bank, and the moment somebody signs the contract, they immediately get the debit card with preloaded bonus money. So they kind of understood that there is bad publicity around reneging on the promises. And this is region specific. Some regions been better than others, but I don't have data. It's more like anecdotal evidence. So it's a great question.
Yeah, these are all fantastic questions. I'm looking at the clock and seeing we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to hear 2 related questions, so I'll ask them. Roger Reese from Texas A&M asks, do the people of the regions, are the people of the region subject to higher mobilization? Do they perceive that they're being punished? And in related vein, Elizabeth Cooper asks, it seems almost counterproductive to punish regions with lower regime support in this way. Is there any evidence that this might cause more participation in anti-war movements or other forms of dissent? So
yeah, we saw some pushback from Dagestan, for example, with high mobilization among mothers, right? But at the same time, so Dagestan and Buryatia, these are the 2 regions that had per capita higher death rates, higher casualties rates. So it's counterproductive. Yes, I agree. But this is what the data actually shows. Maybe regime learn eventually. But for the time being, this is what it is. Just we're running out of time because the meeting is going to be like cut off. I am more than happy to answer questions by email. Okay, my email, I shared my email. I will also put it in chat. And then will people be able to see the chat?
We can circulate your email in some way.
Yeah. I'm more than happy to have this discussion. It's my first name, my last name, and then this is my university. There is a way to select everyone. Okay, I see that Larry is telling, so host and panelists, and then to everyone. I cannot actually select everyone, unfortunately.
We'll find
Okay.
some way. So
Yeah,
that
you'll find it some way, but well, I can actually share my screen, and here it is. Okay, share my screen. So here is my email, okay? And you can email me, and I'm more than happy to have a follow-up discussion if it's useful.
Wonderful. Okay. And I know, yes, we're down to about the last minute. So everyone, thank you very much for joining. Olesya, thank you, first of all, for a phenomenal presentation. Thank you to our audience for joining. I regret that we couldn't get through all of the questions, but please do feel free to follow up with Olesya, and please do check back with the Kennan Institute website and join us for an upcoming event. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for having me. And I will be checking the Kennan website myself to follow the event. Thank you so much.